Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're so delighted, and that you can join us this evening. And we are feel so blessed to have our guests who we'll introduce shortly. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We're delighted to bring you this program to educate us and to inspire us in the understanding of this unprecedented fourth election in Israel and its implications. We're going to ask that most people, if you could during the conversation at the beginning to stay on mute. That'll be helpful to all of us. Believe it or not, we find it actually helps our bandwidth. So those people who live in the poorer parts of Washington, like Cabin John, won't be affected by poor internet that way. And then we also, if you have particular questions in sections of the program this evening, if you'd like to ask a particular question in the chat, you can go in and send those directly to Rabbi Miller or myself, and we'll keep trying to look at those because we're going to go back and forth. I also want to thank Rabbi Miller for joining me and helping organize the program, and just want to say that when he jumps off at about 5 minutes of 8, it is not because he has decided this is overwhelming and the Israeli elections have gotten the better part of him, but he's
overwhelming.
It is, but he is also going to teach the class that he stewards, the 12 Jewish questions, and that's such a vital part of our adult education. We didn't want to sacrifice that at all this evening, so we thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, just briefly, Israel has astounded the world in its response to COVID. It has been able to vaccinate with clarity and with provision and persistence, and in an unprecedented way, setting new standards for healthcare and the response to the COVID. And yet simultaneously, a country that is so organized and so in sync has not been able to form a government in the fashion in which it seems would be healthy and perhaps expedient, and stands ready, stands on the edge of its fourth election. What are the issues that bring this? What are the things that happen in this particular election? And what are the possibilities of its outcomes and the implications, not only for Israel domestically, not only for Israel internationally, but also for us to think about this: if our own lives and identities are inextricably tied to Israel in a global society, what implications does this election also have for us as Reformed Jews here in America? So I'm delighted that we have this opportunity for this discussion and this evening of learning. And really couldn't be more exciting on the edge of the election in Israel. And I'll call on Rabbi Miller to introduce our panel this evening.
To help us make sense of this unwieldy political moment in Israel, we have a panel of internationally celebrated experts that I'm so excited to introduce. I first want to take a moment and introduce Natan Sachs. He's a fellow at Brookings Institute. He's director for their Center for Middle Eastern Policy. He started his academic career as a Fulbright Fellow. It wasn't quite the start, but he was a Fulbright Fellow. He then went on to receive his doctorate and was a fellow at Stanford. He has taught before joining Brookings Institute the Arab-Israeli conflict at Georgetown University. He has obviously done so much more, but for the sake of brevity, thank you, Natan, so much for joining. Carmiel is a senior fellow for Middle Eastern programs at the Atlantic Council. She started as an APAC director of strategic engagement. She has also worked at Brookings Institute for Middle Eastern policy, not only with Natan Sachs, but I heard just recently she introduced Natan and his wife some years ago. So she plays an ever important role in this community we're bringing together tonight. Carmiel worked at the AJC Government Affairs and Public Diplomacy Office. She's the co-founder of Keybridge Strategies, which advances diplomacy around the world. She's a Truman National Security Fellow and recognized as a top foreign policy influencer. Carmiel, thank you so much for joining us. And lastly, Ambassador Aaron Jacob, who joined the AJC in 2003 as the Director of Diplomatic Affairs. Ambassador Jacob was born in Mumbai. He immigrated to Israel with his family in the 1950s. The ambassador served as captain in the IDF. He has continued to serve his country, the nation of Israel, in a number of diplomatic assignments, including the Israeli mission to the UN. From 1998 to 2002, Ambassador Jacob served as the Israeli Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN, which is why we're so excited to have him here speaking on the international ramifications of this unprecedented election. And since 2003, he has joined the AJC and has been the director of their diplomatic affairs. So Ambassador Jacob, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
And we want to give a special shout out to Ambassador Jacobs, who really helped. Jacek Isaacson was going to join us and was part of the original program and reached out just today. And we were thrilled to have somebody of Ambassador Jacobs' esteem to join us. We'd like to begin really asking you, Natan, to give us an overview. A fourth election in 2 years is unheard of. And how did we get here? What are the domestic issues? What has changed from the last election to this one? And what's driving this particular moment in time? And for some of us, we just may even need that basic election 101, because, you know, Israel politics are so clear and so pristine, like mud.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you all for having me. It's really a pleasure. I've been to your community, in fact, at the bris of Carmiel's son, among other events. And I'm really delighted. And Ambassador, it's great to see you again, and an honor to be on a panel with you. So I ordered to do 101. I'll try my best. For a while, before 2016, I would always say that people think that Israeli politics are crazy. And let me tell you how they are crazy and how they're not. And then after 2016, Americans stopped asking me why Israeli politics are so crazy. But then now, in the past 2 years, they're asking that again. So in one sense, Israeli politics are not strange. They are very different from American politics, but I should say in one important way, that's not so weird. Israel has a parliamentary system, which is indeed very different from the American system. But it is actually more common in the world to have parliamentary systems than presidential ones. What that essentially means is that the locus of sovereignty is in parliament. So you could think of it as Congress being the source of all authority, including executive authority. Now, of course, Congress, or in the Israeli case, the Knesset of 120 members, is too large to run a country as an executive. And so, in a sense, parliaments have executive committees, which we could call a cabinet. In Israel, we call it the government, but we really just mean the executive. And they serve on behalf of the Knesset to run the affairs of the government, to execute the decisions of parliament. So obviously the classic one is the old democracy, Britain. And Britain has a parliamentary system, of course. The prime minister, who is only prime minister, he is only the first among equals in his cabinet, is by law necessarily a member of parliament. If Boris Johnson lost his seat in parliament, which he would not because they give him a very safe seat, but if he lost his seat in parliament, he could no longer be prime minister from the logic that he's serving simply as the executive of parliament. That's the case in Israel. The prime minister has to be a member of Knesset by law. So that's not weird. That also means a few things. It means, for example, that if a cabinet loses confidence of the Knesset or doesn't have support of a majority in the Knesset to do important things such as pass a budget, it ceases to function. It ceases to have a mandate to serve as government. And that's very important. That's why you can get so many elections within a 4-year term. The United States, you can have a Congress that flips to the other party. You can have a million things. You can even have a shutdown of government and everyone in DC is walking around with their yoga mats and furloughed and all that. But you will not have new elections for president. Even, God forbid, if a president is assassinated, it's the vice president takes over and there's a long chain of succession. In Israel, if you get the yoga mat situation, then there's simply new elections. And I'll add a point later about why there's never a yoga mat situation. But so in that sense, it's not weird. But Israel is weird in the sense that it's an extreme case in the world in another way. And that's the electoral system by which people elect the parliament that governs. Israel has what's known in political science as a proportional representation system and a rather extreme proportional representation system. So if in the United States, everyone except us has a congressman and everyone except us has a senator, in Israel, there is no senator from Tel Aviv or congressman from New York. There are only members of the Knesset from Israel writ large. It's one district. When you vote in Israel tomorrow, you will be voting in the district of Israel. And everyone is elected together in that single district. That has pluses and minuses. Of course, there's no representation for my neighborhood or my city. But on the other hand, it means that a small minority spread around the country doesn't suffer from the fact that it's spread out. In the United States, if a minority is spread out, it can't have representation as that minority. So how do people vote? Well, they'll go tomorrow into the booth and they will choose literally a piece of paper. The piece of paper will have letters that represent lists of candidates, which is more or less parties. They can be also amalgam of parties, but they're lists of candidates. And when I mean lists, when I say lists, I mean lists. The list of the Likud, for example, which will almost certainly be the largest party, it has the number 1, and next to it, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the first name on the list of the Likud. And by implication also, it's not necessarily, but it's candidate for prime minister. They will vote for these lists, and then all votes will be tallied together from this one district of Israel. They will be tallied together, and the proportion will be calculated. So let's say the Likud gets, let's say, a quarter of the votes. Then it will, in theory, get a quarter of the seats of the Knesset. 120 divided by 4 would be 30, and the Likud would get 30 seats, almost perfectly. This can sound strange for Americans who are used to voting for sheriff and for a million other things. For Israelis, it seems much, much simpler than the American system, I should point out. Everyone votes in the same district. Their votes are tallied equally. There's no gerrymandering because there's literally no districts. And the proportion of the seats is allocated. Now, this is weird in the sense that, weird is the wrong word, it's extreme in the world in the sense that by being almost perfectly proportional, it allows for a very large number of parties. And why is that? Because if you think, for example, in America, if we had this system, it would mean that any minority spread across the United States could have a party. You could imagine, for example, African Americans would not be beholden to one party or another. Today, they vote about 90% for the Democrats. They could instead have 1 or 2 or 3 predominantly African American parties. They'd have enough votes, probably. One of them could be more conservative, one less conservative, a variety of different differences. There could be more regional parties, a party of the South, a party of the Northeast, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly what we have in Israel. We have parties, for example, for the ultra-Orthodox or Haredi community. In fact, 2 different lists that amalgam 3 different parties, but 2 lists, one Ashkenazi, one Sephardic. The Arab population in Israel, which is 1/5 of the citizenry of Israel, not the Palestinians in the territories, but inside Israel, who are citizens, are about 1/5 of the population. They vote as well in an amalgam we can talk about later, and et cetera, et cetera. And so on the left, you can have shades of left. I'm very leftist, I'm not so leftist, and on the right, you get the point. So Israel has a very large number of parties, and you can have many number of elections if the majority of the Knesset itself is not clear, which is where we are today. I'll say one important wrinkle, and it's very important for the elections tomorrow, is that there is a minimum threshold. So it's not perfectly proportional. If you get enough votes for 1 seat, you don't get in. You used to, but you don't anymore. Today, the law requires to get enough basically for 4 seats of the 120. So anything below 4 seats, those votes are simply discarded. The total votes, they're considered invalid votes, as if you wrote gibberish on your note, and all the rest of the seats are divided by the rest of the parties. That means that parties that are polling right around 4, and we have about 3 or 4 parties that are polling around 4 seats right now, if they happen to fall below 4, and that can be random, of course, if they happen to fall below it, all their votes are discarded, and their votes will be split basically evenly among the 2 big camps. All right, end of 101. So why do we have 4 elections in 4 years? Well, as I said, you can have it if you don't have a majority, but you'd expect that if one person doesn't have a majority, then someone else would have a majority, and at some point it would work itself out. This is unprecedented. Israel has never had even 2 elections in 1 year. It's now having 4 in 2 years, really 4 successive. We're calling this the 4th round of basically the same election. And it's election with one overriding topic. And the topic is consisted of two words, Benjamin Netanyahu. This is about him. Historically in Israel, you have all sorts of topics, very important ones, war and peace, territories, returning the land, not returning the land, building settlements, not building settlements, of course, economic issues and health, and there's COVID, you may have heard of, and a few other things that are happening. But in Israel today, the elections are between two camps, and that's the Bibi bloc, the bloc that supports Bibi Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the change bloc, as it's called in this round at least. And that change bloc includes right-wing parties who traditionally would have supported Netanyahu and did in the past support Netanyahu. And today, some of them have vowed not to support him under any circumstances. And you have, and moreover, in terms of economics, of course, you have right-wing and left-wing economics on all sides. So why this mess? Well, it's basically boils down to the fact that Benjamin Netanyahu has a very strong following among his base, a very loyal base that is sticking with him through thick and thin. And secondly, that thick and thin are very deep legal troubles. He's on trial already for three different cases of corruption, including a count of bribery. And that has led quite a few in the political system, including now on the right wing, to break with him and to say that they will not serve in his government under any circumstances and that he must go. Now, usually what would happen is that someone who faced that fate, especially going on trial in Israel's history, that has happened before. The predecessor, the immediate predecessor to Netanyahu, Ehud Olmert, went on trial, in fact, went to prison for corruption. When he was indicted, he resigned, and he resigned in part under pressure from his coalition partners. Smart Alex, like me, thought that this would happen to Netanyahu, and I was wrong. Bibi's much better at politics than I am. He decided he would stick through it. He would push through. He would simply not let any opposition, including within his own party, bring him down. And he has proved capable of securing almost exactly half of the population to support him in this. This half has been slightly below and sometimes exactly at half in the past 4 rounds, but never slightly above, partly by chance. So what we're looking for tomorrow, what matters, is not exactly how large his Likud party is or another party. What really matters is the block of parties that are supporting Netanyahu, the Netanyahu bloc, including one party that is sort of wavering in particular, led by Naftali Bennett. That's the far-right party called Yamina, rightward. If they together pass 61, which is half of the 120 members of the Knesset, Netanyahu will almost certainly form a coalition. And if he does, one of the first things this coalition will probably do is some combination of firing the Attorney General, who is a bureaucrat, he's not a political appointee, or maybe changing the law to grant immunity to prime ministers. But in any case, making sure that the number one priority, which is keeping Netanyahu out of prison, will be fulfilled. This is exactly what will not happen if we have the alternative coalition. Now, that alternative coalition can get to also maybe later, but it's the math is very difficult. It's very hard to imagine. If Netanyahu loses, quote unquote, it's very difficult to combine the opposition into a coalition. And so likely tomorrow we may know that Netanyahu has won if enough votes are counted. It won't be tomorrow, it'll be Wednesday. We may not know. We may have to wait and see if the small parties have passed the threshold. And moreover, if he has not won, we will have to see if the opposition manages to cobble together a coalition. It will be very hard because the ideological differences between the far left in that opposition and the real far right now in this potential opposition are extreme. And if they cannot, a quite realistic possibility is a 5th election sometime in the early fall. That is quite possible if Netanyahu does not win. Let me say 2 more things and I'll shut up. There are some new things in this election. First, in the past we have seen this Netanyahu anti-Netanyahu camp, but it's much more pronounced this time. In this 4th round, we have especially a splinter from the Likud party called New Hope, led by someone named Gideon Sa'ar, who is a Likudnik and more right-wing than Netanyahu, more hawkish than Netanyahu, clearly. The list he's put together is very hawkish and very traditional Likud. So it's really positioning itself as Likud B or Likud Bet. And they are offering Gideon Sa'ar as an alternative Likud leader. Because this should be clear. If Netanyahu had stepped aside at any moment, in these 2 years, it's very likely that the Likud, his own party, would have successfully formed a government just with someone else at the head. And that is something he would not accept, in particular because he faces the possibility of prison. So that's a big change. A second change, of course, is that there's a different president in the United States. I'm sure the ambassador will speak about that. An important change also is in the Arab vote, which we can discuss. I'm sure others will. And finally, I'll just say a small thing that has happened, which is a pandemic. Israel's undergone a year like everyone. We're on Zoom right now. This has been a very strange time. As the rabbi said, Israel, on the one hand, has been very successful with the vaccination. On the other hand, the handling of the pandemic itself is generally considered to be extremely poor. So a mix sort of a very bad strategy and very big success on the tactics of the vaccination, so much so that Israel is now more than 50% vaccinated. So a very mixed bag and a complicated one. And secondly, a very important legacy of the normalization agreements between Israel and some of the Arab states, in particular the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. These are very important and heighten a fundamental strength of Netanyahu, which is his basic tagline throughout these 2 years has been, there's no one really in my league who can replace me. Show me someone else who can have such influence like I did in the Trump White House, who can speak to Putin whenever he wants, who has a bromance with Narendra Modi, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore I'm a class above the rest. So whatever they say about the corruption, that's all just manipulation. That's not true. Vote for someone of my stature. That's basically has been his line. It's been, I can tell you how successful it's been, exactly half. The latest polls give him exactly half, but we don't know. Tomorrow, so many variables can go in different directions. Only a fool would predict, and I certainly have no idea if 60 will become 69 or 59, as if 60 becomes 61 or 59. But I'll give you a hint. Those who are sure they know if 60 becomes 59 or 61, don't listen to them. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Before we move on to another question, I just want to give a chance if Ms. Arbit, if you would like to add, or the ambassador would like to add in any way, just to the overall, picture of where we are as of now. And one thing that you might address, one of you, is the we had a situation in which in the last election that we thought that there was going to be a shared government, and yet something happened in which that shared government did not come into existence. And we had Benny Gantz, who was going to, who at first said he wouldn't serve with Netanyahu and then did. So if anybody just wants to illuminate on us how we ended up, even with the last election, with only one prime minister instead of a shared government.
Carmiel, would you like to address it, or would you like me to address it?
You have the floor, start, and then I'll hop in after you.
Okay, so first of all, regarding the shared government, the rotating government, this is the second experience that Israel had with that. Between 1984 and 1988, Israel had a rotating government, first headed by Shimon Peres and then by Shimon Shamir. It was not the best experience that you can imagine, but still the agreement was respected by both parties, contrary to the current situation whereby the agreement was not sustained. Now, regarding the excellent presentation made by Natan, perhaps I would add just two comments regarding the Israeli domestic scene. And first of all, and Natan alluded to that, but I would like to add, in the past 2.5 decades, the Israeli political system had become even more fragmented than it was in the country's earlier years. 13 parties are currently represented in the Knesset, of which the two largest, Likud and Yesh Atid, hold 36 and 17 seats respectively. And the second point is that the Israeli politics have also become more ethnically oriented. In the 1950s and the 1960s, ethnically based parties never achieved more than 4 or 5 seats in the Knesset. In the current Knesset, two parties with 7 and 9 seats respectively, Israel Beitenu with 7 seats and which is based on or drove its support from Russian immigrants, and Sachs, the ultra-Orthodox Sephardic party, which has 9 seats, are by and large ethnically based. The Arab joint list, which had 15 seats in the Knesset, is ethnically based by definition. So this means that about 1/4 of the seats in the Knesset are held by parties that represent not necessarily the mosaic of the Israeli society, but rather certain segments of it. Actually, the ethnically based character of the Israeli politics is even more pronounced because the Likud base, it comes in large measure from the Sephardic immigrants in Israel, the Bnei Edot HaMizrach, and the United Torah, the ultra-Orthodox party, the other ultra-Orthodox party, is basically the Ashkenazi segment of the ultra-Orthodox population in Israel. So both Israel has become more fragmented and has become more ethnically based in terms of politics. I don't want to, doesn't take away from the fact that Israel is a genuine and vibrant democracy, but we have to pay attention to these 2 factors.
I'll just jump in. Well, first, I can't jump in without thanking both of you rabbis for including me in this panel. And to sit on a panel with Aaron and Natan is pretty amazing because really, I think everything I know about Israel, I learned from the 2 of them. So it's hard to think that I'll have much to add, but I want to kind of take us to the present state of play for a moment as we look to what's going to be happening tomorrow. You know, I saw a poll today that said 15 seats are up for grabs right now in this election. And if you think about how fragmented the parties are as opposed to the last 4 elections, it really means that anyone sitting here, it's really anyone's guess. You know, in the US, we talk about an October surprise, but in Israel, the surprise is always the day after the elections, where Israelis for months have been lying to pollsters, which they do for all sorts of reasons, also just to watch them squirm on TV so that when, you know, folks are sitting on panels like this, we can sound like idiots. And they lie during exit polls. And so you don't actually know until really the 11th hour who has won. And then, as Natan said, the real work begins, which will be the lobbying and the jockeying to pull together a coalition. So if you look at kind of the 3 scenarios that Natan laid out, where you have Bibi winning and cobbling together a very right-wing government, what would arguably be the most right-wing government probably in my sort of adult lifetime. And if you account for the fact that he is bringing in what was, you know, the leader of a Jewish power party versus some very unrealistic kind of team of rivals scenario where all of these smaller parties are able to cobble together either a power sharing agreement, which I think would be the most likely scenario. Again, none of them able to align politically, or what is increasingly looking likely, which is a 5th election. And all of this kind of leads us back to where we started before, which is an Israeli government that is in total gridlock, that hasn't been able to form a government or form a budget since 2018, really to the detriment of their people. And so the one thing that has been absent in all of this is a conversation about how to get at the problems that Natan laid out in 101, which are structural. What enables this system to happen and perpetuate in this way? And so I think that that is the thing that has been most absent from the entire conversation in Israel, and yet the theme that has permeated each of these elections. So I'll just throw that out there.
Thank you so much.
Also, Carmiel, one of the things that both the ambassador and Natan brought up is the evolving role of the Arab vote, which has seen so many ups and downs, and now is experiencing, you know, now that vote is in high demand. Can you give a little bit of background into how this voting bloc developed and the role it might play in tomorrow's elections?
Absolutely. So I think actually this is the most interesting and certainly one of the hottest topics right now in Israel has been the Arab vote. So as Natan said, you're talking about 20% of the population is Arab. And yet Bibi has really kind of made a name in the international stage through his incendiary comments towards the Arab community. We all remember the 2015 line, you know, warning, warning, the Arabs are voting in droves. In this election, Bibi had a revelation, which is warning, warning, the Arabs are voting in droves. There's an opportunity here. And there is no savvier politician than Bibi Netanyahu. And so he has looked at every possible angle to rip off a piece of that. So it's taken on a couple of different forms. Bibi Netanyahu is now calling himself Abu Yair, meaning the Arab moniker for father of Yair. We won't even talk about his son and what that draws up. He's playing, you know, in his jingles, he's doing the Arabic Likud anthem. I mean, it's really a 180 from what we've seen. And he's doing this for two reasons. First, what he has successfully done is broken up the Arab Joint List, which consisted of very disparate Arab parties, from the Communist Party to the Islamist Party, that had come together to form a bloc to avoid the threshold problem, and in the process became a formidable group with 15 seats in the last election. And so what Bibi did is he effectively reached out to Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Islamist group, and really put his finger on what were already a number of tensions playing out within the joint list, both over disagreements over policy, most recently on LGBTQ issues, but also generally there's been a failure on the part of the joint list to deliver. There's a lot of internal infighting, a lot of disillusionment among the Arab community. And in engaging Abbas, he was able to break him off, so he's no longer part of the joint list. And so in the process, he has weakened the joint list. Abbas might not even pass the threshold. The joint list will now be probably about 8 seats, and he's really exploited it because Bibi really knows how to do it. He is really savvy, not just at winning, but at really breaking apart and taking down his rivals. So that's kind of the first thing that he's done in that context. But the second is that he is really reaching out for the Arab vote. Now, intuitively, that sounds crazy, but if you look at the last election, he actually brought in 10,000 Arab votes into Likud. And if you figure he's really only looking to generate 1 or 2 or 3 extra seats for Likud, there's a lot of votes that are up for grabs here. And so what he's been doing is parachuting into Arab villages, particularly vaccination clinics, an issue for which he is most popular, meeting with more Arab communities than he arguably met with in the entirety of his time as prime minister, and making promises. One of the biggest challenges in the Arab community right now is violence. 90% of murders in the past year happened within the Arab community. There have been more than 24 already this year. And so the challenges are formidable. They feel that it is a result of a lack of policing. There's a long litany of things that the Arab community is looking for. Their economic situation is routinely below that of their Jewish counterparts, bad infrastructure, you name it. And so Arab politicians have been promising their constituencies that they would deliver on these issues, and they haven't been able to. And so now Bibi sees an opportunity, and he is promising the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, whether he remembers them after the election happens is another question. But I think what's really interesting about what he's done, and what you're also seeing, by the way, in this election trend, because of this, there's sort of a legitimization of the Arab community that's happened. So there are now more Arab candidates in Jewish, quote unquote, Jewish lists than we've ever seen before, which is pretty remarkable. And what this does is it raises a question. You know, Bibi is doing this undoubtedly for short-term expedient political gains, but it could have a meaningful lasting impact, which is that this could now create an opportunity where Arabs are not only brought into the political fold, or perhaps even break the greatest taboo, which would be serving inside of a government, as opposed to just acting as a kingmaker outside, where they, for example, endorsed Gantz only to be sold out down the road in a very complicated fight that ensued. But there is definitely an opportunity in the future. And so when I think about the biggest kind of change makers that this election could have, you know, why is this election different than all others? I think the Arabs are really front and center on that.
Natan and Ambassador Jacob, do you have comments on the this rise of the importance of the Arab vote in Israel these days?
I think it's, it's fascinating. It's a huge change. This about face by Bibi is amazing, just as Carmi said very well. I think um, the joint list was always a strange thing. I mean, it was an amalgam of four parties as disparate and different from one another as you could imagine communists and Islamists. And the reason is that they were literally communists and Islamists with two nationalist parties, one very extreme and one not. The Islamists have now, that's Mansour Abbas has now sort of hinted that he may even support Netanyahu when he's up for grabs. As Garmi said very well, it has two sides to it. I mean, I mentioned the African American community. What Trump was constantly saying to them was, listen, you're beholden to one party in the United States. What has that got you? Instead, play both sides, see what you'll get from both of us. And there's a logic to that, right? And Trump, in fact, did slightly better among African Americans and also certainly among Latinos. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was literally Bibi's people and Bibi himself looking at the United States and saying, actually, why not? We have a full community here. It's 20% of the country, but it's a whole population. Of course, there's some people there who will vote for anyone, who will prefer mundane issues and not be beholden only to the Palestinian issue, etc. And there's some votes to be gained there. And moreover, exactly as Carmi said, by breaking the joint list, weaken them tremendously. So it's a very interesting dynamic. We'll have to see, if the small party, the Islamist party, passes the threshold, would they, in the moment of truth, even support Netanyahu in exchange for something? It's not out of the question. I don't know if they would be the tiebreaker. I think they would not be. But if the tie is already broken and Netanyahu is destined to form a coalition, they could deal. It's really amazing. You see the very, very extreme right wing, actual Kahanist successors, so genuinely successors to a deeply, deeply racist party, even say, well, Abbas, if he changes his views, maybe he's okay. We're in the twilight zone, and I don't say that in a good way. I think it's a sign of the times where everything is beholden to the fate of one individual who has merit, who has credit, but no country should ever be beholden to the fate of one individual, no matter who he is. And it's a sign of it. We're in fourth election now, and it really does feel like the twilight zone.
If I may just add a comment, the Israel Declaration of Independence from 1948 promised the Arab minority equal rights. And it is an ongoing, it's a work in progress. Israel needs to perfect itself as a democracy, including its treatment of the Arab minority. Yet I want to point out two trends in the Arab population. First of all, the birth rates have declined. Now, historically and universally, birth rates decline only when the standard of living rises. So that indicates that the Arab population is doing better economically, which is very much in the interest of Israel. And second, and this is my personal experience, I visit my family in Beersheba, I visit the hospital occasionally. Many doctors, many people at the hospital are Arabs, actually, and Bedouin from the Negev, which is again an indication that they are gaining ground in professions that in the past they were excluded from.
So that leads to a follow-up question to you, Carmiel, which is, as we see the role of the Arabs taking a larger role, you have written on, and Rabbi Miller pointed this out earlier, that you've written on that the fact that as the Arabs' role takes in, the traditional role of women has diminished. We no longer have the women in the Knesset and other things. What role do women take in this, and what do you attribute sort of that change?
Yeah, thank you. It's an interesting question and an interesting phenomena that we've seen start really since the beginning of this 4-election cycle, if you will, whereas at one point there had been 3 women at the helm of parties, you've seen that decline. So in the last election, there were none. And in this one, there is one, Merav Michaeli. And I want to just stop to talk about her for a moment because she really is kind of an amazing feminist icon, albeit leading a party that may not even cross the threshold, which is pretty phenomenal when you consider what a legacy party labor is. But Merav Michaeli is one of the only candidates who has led a party that was not specifically dedicated to women's issues while elevating them. So she, for those of you who aren't familiar with her, kind of got her career started as doing military radio, worked her way through television, was really kind of a celebrity in her own right, which is not such an uncommon way to get into politics in Israel, interestingly enough. To be successful,
America
you need a
too.
military background. Huh?
You said America too.
In America too, indeed, increasingly. So yeah, so you can't be as successful though in Israel, unfortunately, without that military background, but at least having that celebrity space will get you on the docket. You have the name recognition. And Merav Michaeli is someone who really takes her feminist ideals to an extreme, both in her personal life. She speaks, I don't know for those of you who speak Hebrew, but she speaks in the feminine plural, which is really strange to the ear, I have to say, even as a feminist. But really to infuse her feminism into everything that she does. She is the only party leader who insisted that 50% of her docket be female. So every other slot went to a woman. But again, may not cross the threshold. What you see in some of the other parties, I think in 6 of the parties, women are kind of riding co-pilot, so have second slots in Lapid's party, in New Hope, in Meretz, in even religious Zionism has. So you kind of, you see that, but they're not at the top of the list. And this is really the product of a number of different issues, some of which are systemic and some of which are not. So unlike many parliamentary systems, controversially or not, Israel does not have quotas. So parties themselves may institute quotas, but there is not an across the board quota. The reason that you would need something like that is that there is a difference in equality of opportunity for women trying to get into politics in Israel. So for example, the way that the lists run, you have to be able to fundraise. And a lot of the fundraising system is really created in a way that makes it very difficult for women to be successful. There's also sort of this is probably an inappropriate term, but it's the first one to come to mind, sort of the fetishization of the military within Israel. If you want to succeed, you need to have a meaningful, substantive military background. So as I said, you can be a figurehead to get in, but if you don't have those chops, you aren't seen as strong enough on security. We've seen this in all of the challengers against Bibi Netanyahu. That's sort of necessary, but not sufficient, we're also coming to understand. And that disproportionately affects women. So you kind of have this broader system that is making it that much more challenging for women to excel. So on the one hand, you have some progress, on the other hand, not. I saw one number that sort of was running the different algorithms that said, it's possible that women could assume 34 seats in this election based on the most likely parties and so forth. Because what often happens is that women will find themselves at the bottom of a ticket. And so, for example, in Lapid's party, they're in the top 4, but then you don't see them again till the bottom. And they're never going to cross the threshold. They're never going to get those seats. But even with that being the number, that would still put women at about 28% of the Knesset, which is pretty dismal. Now you can compare that to the United States where it's about 27%. But when you compare it to the world, it's pretty embarrassing. So in 2019, Israel was ranked 53 in terms of women in parliament. But by 2020, they were ranked 84, something like that. And what changed? Nothing changed, but the world is changing. And so you see women gaining positions of power around the world, and it's just not happening at the same pace for Israel. And this is something that I think is now becoming more a part of the discourse in a way that it hadn't been. I think, we kind of take for granted as Zionists and the legacy of Golda Meir, Supreme Court justices who are women who are just paving the way in the military and combat units, you name it. And so we think of Israel as this place where women can really get ahead. CEOs, head of the bank. I mean, I can really go through the list, and the Knesset just hasn't enabled that. Also in positions of influence within the Knesset, we haven't seen it. So the challenges are formidable. I would say we're a little bit better off than we were in the last election, but still really have a long way to go.
Thank you. I want to just, there have been a couple of questions that have come in that just before we move to the ambassador on to talk about the international implications and the some of those things. The real question is that, as you know, Natan has laid out, this being about one particular character, and a number of questions have come in asking, will the Israeli population, if there's a government that's formed by Netanyahu, stand for the dismissal of the AG and the orchestrating of his own freedom on a political level without really having any sense of justice? Will the Israeli population tolerate such a thing?
Well, this is not a foreign policy question. This is a domestic question.
Well, that's why I was stressing,
but
before we got to it.
My sense is that the Israeli government will not support such a decision by the prime minister. Even supporters of Netanyahu, I think, will oppose that, because that would undermine the notion that Israel is a rule of law country. But let me address the foreign policy implications, or make some.
Just before you do that, I'd like to see if the others have a comment.
Oh, sure.
On that, and then we'll move to the foreign policy.
I respectfully disagree. I think there's an advantage to a fourth election in the sense that there's clarity. There's also a disadvantage to it. So the clarity, Netanyahu after the first election vehemently, but before it and then after the first election, vehemently denied that he was looking for immunity. After the first election, it became perfectly clear that that was his demand in coalition negotiations. The good part of that is that it's clear. Now Israelis know what they're voting on. The bad part of that, in my view, is that if he wins a majority, the question was, will the Israeli public stand for it? We will have an answer, a definitive, official, legal answer, which is yes, they voted for that. And so if his coalition wins more than 61, I think the chance, I don't know that it will happen. It depends how large his coalition is and how he frames it. The chance that he will of course not propose it. He doesn't deal with such things. He'll happen to be one of his minions who does it. But I think the chance is very high that it's proposed. And I think the chance is fair that it passes depending on the size of his coalition. And I say this in part because for two reasons. One is that he himself has will have won the election as an individual. It'll be very clear that the elector voted for that. Secondly, there is a legitimate debate about the role of the judiciary, on which I can have opinions, but there's also a legitimate debate. How active should the judiciary be or not? There are many people on the right, including Gideon Saar, who want to have dramatic reform of the judiciary and weaken the judiciary. And I may agree or disagree, but it's a legitimate position to have. It's a conservative position about the judiciary, not about an individual. And if you conjoin those two things together, it's quite easy for right-wing parties that really would not want to support individual legislation to get one guy out of prison to say, look, Israel has gone through 4 elections. We have to end this nonsense. I anyway support complete reform of the judiciary. And besides, the voter has said yes. So the answer is, would the public go for it? If they vote 61 for Bibi tomorrow, then they will have answered the question, yes.
So before we get to the international, there is this real tension between Israeli domestic politics and Bibi, who is on the, will say and do and is a phenomenal politician. On the one hand, he, last election, he was so abrasive to the Arabs and so undignified. And on the next, this time he's, Abu. So it's this chameleon. And at the same time, he's played the same thing internationally. On the one hand, wrote and in just the last week is, he touts international stature and what he's able to do, but he's also playing, instead of attacking the Arabs inside of Israel, he's somewhat attacking the Arabs and showing his dislike of Arabs outside of Israel. So he played the game with, or he had the situation with the Jordanian government and a visit to the Temple Mount. He then had the skirmish about airspace not being shared, and then was condemned in many ways by Sheikh Zayed at the UAE for his saying that I've made this opportunity to bring billions of dollars into Israel's economy, and really has undermined in many ways, for many ideas, the foundations and the trust of the Abrahamic Accord. So given that sort of framework, in a sense, how do you see this all playing out and with the new American administration, ambassador, because you sat in that UN, you've been in all these meetings, you've played this role in so many ways. Tell us what your crystal ball tells us.
Well, the next Israeli government, whether led by Netanyahu or by one of its political rivals, will face, in my view, two major challenges: the Palestinian issue and Iran. And in both instances, there is a possibility of disagreement with the US. So let me begin with the Palestinian issue. The Palestinian question has divided the Israeli society for many years. It is, in my view, the most important issue that Israel is facing, because it is about what Israel aspires to be as a nation, Jewish, democratic, or both. However, this issue is, in the first time since 1967, the Palestinian-Israeli issue had been missing from the political discourse, which had been relegated into divisions based on pro and anti-Netanyahu affiliation with little substantive political policy discourse. Traditionally, the US has supported a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on negotiations on Israel's security on the one hand, and on the other hand, the national aspirations of the Palestinian people. This policy has evolved over the years, culminating in President George W. Bush's vision of two states living side by side in peace and security. The Biden administration, at the very beginning of its term, has reaffirmed its commitment to that policy, though it has also made clear that it doesn't expect any progress in this front in the near future. However, if, and that is a big if, following the Palestinian election in May, the Palestinians would establish a unity government willing to accept the three conditions set by the international community, meaning renouncing violence and terrorism, recognizing Israel, and accepting existing agreements with Israel, between Israel and the Palestinians, it could create a new dynamic in the political process. If not, and this is the more likely scenario, I have to admit, the next Israeli government will happily embrace the political and territorial status quo in the Palestinian area. That said, the Israeli government will be significantly more constrained in expanding settlements, or else it would risk clashing with the Biden administration. Also, during the previous three election cycles, annexation was of parts of the West Bank was at the top of the political discourse. Annexation, it seems, is no longer in the cards because of the possibility of A, clash with the Biden administration, and B, because it could unravel the Abrahamic accords, which are based on the premise that Israel will not annex the part of the West Bank. Now, the second issue is Iran. And regarding Iran, the US and Israel share the same strategic goal regarding Iran, preventing it from acquiring nuclear weapons. But they have conceptual and strategic differences regarding the issue. The first is the perception of threat. Israel views the prospect of a nuclear Iran as an existential threat. The US, on the other hand, views Iran not an existential, but a strategic threat, fearing that an Iranian bomb would trigger a nuclear race in the Middle East and establish Iran as the dominant power in the region. The second issue is the breakout time required for Iran to cross the nuclear threshold. Israel is a strong country and capable of defending itself against immediate neighbors. But Iran, which is located more than 1,000 miles from Israel, presents a major logistical and operational challenges for the IDF. given its limited capabilities, Israel sees allowing Iran to stay very close to the nuclear threshold. 1 year, according to the 2015 nuclear deal, as too risky. The US, as the world's strongest military power, possesses the capability to destroy Iran's nuclear weapon program and prevent Iran from restoring it. So therefore, it can tolerate a risk of leaving Iran with a shorter breakout capability. Now, that said, the Biden administration said that it would strive to achieve a stronger and longer agreement with Iran on its nuclear capabilities. But I think that the perspective here from Israel on the one hand and the Biden administration on the one hand are different. The Israelis will have to use very skilled diplomacy in order not to clash the Biden administration. For instance, currently the Biden administration is seeking to resume discussions with Iran, informal discussions, which are, first of all, about Iran retracting from all the steps it has taken in violation of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, and on the other hand, as a reciprocal action by the US, lifting the sanctions that were imposed by the Trump administration in 2018. So this is the declared goal of the United States, but it would begin by restoring US membership in the JCPOA. And here again, it would take a great deal of diplomacy on part of Israel not to clash with the Biden administration over the Iranian issue.
And that's in the background, and I'd love to hear Natan and Carmiel, your response, but this is in a backdrop in which in this election cycle, for domestic purposes and for the winning of election, Netanyahu has, as I pointed out, has done many things to alienate some of his best partners in the Middle East, which does not seem to be, it may be short-term expedience, but does not seem to speak well for the long-term foreign policy goals. Natan or Carmiel, would you like to add anything to these about how you see these, the international?
Yeah, I'm going to pick up on kind of where you left off about the tensions he's having now with his Arab allies. You know, Bibi Netanyahu has really thrived on being a world leader, and that means parading onto international stages, shaking hands with foreign leaders, and leveraging those relationships to really promote himself as the irreplaceable, you know, Israel's man overseas. And he was able to do that really well in the Trump administration because Trump was constantly kind of handing him little election favors and nuggets, the, you know, defense pact that never was, but was announced on the eve of the election and so forth. And he's come into this election a little empty-handed. And so he has two challenges. One, he has a Biden administration that waited just long enough to call him. It's COVID, and so travel has been challenging. And here he has the Arab world where he has, you know, helped usher in really what anyone following these issues for a long time, you know, I know you've been working on them, Rabbi, AJC has been working on this for literally decades. And yet no one really could have imagined
Whoops. We're losing her.
And this peace. What?
We just lost you. Just repeat that last part. No one could have imagined.
Oh, we couldn't really have imagined this regional peace would come to fruition. And Bibi and Trump, by the way, are at the helm of this. And so this should be an amazing opportunity and thing for him to leverage. And he tried to, and he failed. And so effectively, you had a couple of different things happen. I mean, first you had Bibi leaking to the press that he was going to meet with the leader of Mauritania in the United Arab Emirates when he touched down to meet with the crown prince. Then it was that the Saudi crown prince was going to be there. And so he was seeding all of this in the media, really just playing up Bibi is not just the past broker of peace in the region, but Bibi as the future and continued broker. And only Bibi can do this. And he's really good at this message. It doesn't necessarily bring him new voters, but it solidifies his role as indispensable. And because of his fight with the Jordanians, as you mentioned, and they denied him overflight access, he couldn't do it. It was a huge botch. And so this like campaign ploy that he relies on didn't come to fruition. And the UAE doubled down because, they had announced that there was going to be, that he had announced that there was going to be this big multi-billion-dollar bilateral venture and that it was happening. And then the UAE stepped up and said, hold on a second, we're just in discussions. They're cutting him down at every corner because they do not want to be seen as a ploy in this election. And so it's very interesting for Bibi because he's quickly learning the limitations of these new relationships, however warm the peace, especially with the UAE, is set up to be.
So Natan, I want to give you a chance, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about the domestic, how you see that, but also what is it that is appealing from Netanyahu that he is winning 50% of the Israeli population's vote? No poll has him sort of under, the 30 seats or 30 or more in a sense. What is the magic that's there and what's driving this? But first, Natan, how do you see this international situation?
Well, I think excellent things have already been said. I'll just briefly add that a lot, as Carmiel alluded, actually both the speakers alluded, a lot of this has to do with the United States. So a lot of Israel's position in the world throughout history, actually, at least since the 60s or the 70s in particular, has been this perception that the road to Washington goes through Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. And in the 70s, especially, the peace with Egypt had a lot to do with Egypt looking for a break with the Soviet Union and moving over to the American orbit. And this is true to the day. I mean, the UAE has its own reasons to have normal relations with Israel, but part of that has to do with Washington. And that has to do both for good reasons and sometimes even for bigotry. I mean, the perception that the Jews control Washington is very pervasive around the world, and sometimes it helps Israel because Israel, countries around the world think that you want to rule the world, you got to be friends with Israel. So the change in Washington in that regard is very important. It's not that Biden is not a friend of Israel, not far from it, but it is the case that this administration is not going to spend as much effort as the Trump administration, not just effort, but political capital and other interests of the United States for the sake of one more normalization deal. So if you take Morocco, for example, and I'm delighted that there are slightly more normal relations between Israel and Morocco. From the United States perspective, the decision to recognize sovereignty over Western Sahara was a very big diplomatic gift, correct or incorrect, a very big one. That's the kind of thing you're not going to see from the Biden administration. So Netanyahu is, and this partly answers the beginning of an answer to your second question, Netanyahu is banking in part on this perception that he is a player at the highest level of world affairs. And in no small part that owes to the success of the last 4 years, where he was extremely close to the Trump administration with a very, very powerful ambassador in Israel who, if he were Israeli, would be on the far right of Israeli politics, far right. And this allowed Netanyahu to position himself that way. I'll just say, you may guess, I'm not a fan of Netanyahu's, but we should point out, and I would not vote for him if I were in Israel right now, but he is a very able man. He is extremely experienced. He is in some ways Trump-like, but he's not Trump. He's a very intelligent, very erudite. He's a very well-read person. He and is very experienced. So this claim that he is a player at the world stage is simply correct. And the fact that all his competitors are simply not there is simply true. Even if you prefer one of them as prime minister, obviously to reach that level on the diplomatic stage would take years and skills that they may not have. They don't have his English, they don't have his PR abilities, and they don't have his experience. So that is part of what appeals. I'll say another point, which is that Netanyahu himself, but also his camp even before him, but especially Netanyahu, does have a very strong following among important segments of the population. many different segments. The Likud is a large party and the right wing is very, very large. But there are important segments of the population that see support for Netanyahu as almost an identity matter by now, and see him as a bit of a tribune of the underprivileged against the leftist elite. This is a very strong perception. And that, yes, all these intellectuals and all these leftists and all these liberals in America, they don't like him, but guess what? He fights for us. And all these corruption charges are trumped up, they're not true. And if they are true, who cares? And he's our guy. And if he's a bit nasty sometimes, great. I want my leader and my lawyer. I don't want my lawyer to be nice. I want my lawyer to be tough and fight for me. And he is, so as much as there are many Israelis who really don't like him, and of course, many Democrats in the United States who don't, he is very much loved among some Israelis, and even among many others, appreciated even when he's opposed. There are some things about him that I think, I myself too think, are worthy of appreciation.
Mr. Ambassador, your thoughts, because you alluded to this in the dichotomy that you set up, which is, so clear and so cogent about these two fronts facing not only Israel in foreign policy, but also in its domestic concern. Iran is, of great concern. And the Palestinian question and the two-state solution or not is, and the change of annex is huge. What is he doing that it gives him the 50% of Israel's vote?
Well, the term populism hasn't been used so far in this discussion, but I think Likud had invented populism many years before populism had become a major movement in the United States or in Europe. It had been for many, many years. And what Natan has just said about appealing to the underprivileged, about waging war against the perceived elites, against the Ashkenazis, against the kibbutznik. I grew up on a kibbutz and I'm a Sephardic Jew, but still, this has been the effective tools in the hands of the Likud. And one characteristic of populism, and not only in Israel, but in many other countries, one of the geniuses of populism is the ability to be in power, hold all the levers of power, and at the same time be in the opposition. Because there is always somebody to blame, somebody who is now in the opposition or in the minority for all the ills that befall the Israeli society. And I think the Likud has perfected that practice during its years in power. Again, I agree with Natan. Netanyahu is a very skilled operator. He had the base that admired him, and I don't see any possibility that and it had become very much an identity politics for them. So it's a vote for Netanyahu, and it is a vote for all the perceived elites that had humiliated the people when they immigrated to Israel in the 1950s and with Putin, Ma'abarot, and all the other things that go with that.
And he successfully really orchestrated through the Trump administration the changing of the location of the embassy, which everybody felt that the sky was going to fall down, it was going to end all opportunities and all this. And it did not have the political ramifications that everybody did. And for a lot of people, and I make no judgment, it restored a certain amount of dignity and restored a sense of what Israel's right and hegemony is, whether we agree with this or not. I want to ask, I want to move back to domestic, and I'm, as a Reform rabbi who gets their shots every now and then from a variety of locations, both domestic and foreign. I'm interested, in Israel's national law, which, is a prelude to many things that may take place in Israel, which are really going to diminish a tremendous amount of world juries' rights. There is, in many sense, no left. The politics that you grew up with, Ambassador, and the ones that, I lived on Kibbutz Malach HaMisha, and the idea that labor doesn't really exist almost in in a lot of sense. And if we took things, everything is shifted once to the right, or this is the right, I guess, once to the right and again to the right, and where are we on that? And what do we see in the future in terms of what may happen to the pluralism and the very document that you talked about that talks about the nature of all people being represented in Israel. How do you see this happening, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, I think that the shift to the right that has occurred in the Israeli society is the result of two things. First of all, the religious parties, which in the 50s and the 60s were affiliated with the labor ruling party, Mapai at that time, moved in the direction of the Likud. And the Likud actually had cultivated this movement by moving some of the ultra-Orthodox people to the territory. Beitar elite, for instance, in the West Bank, is populated by ultra-Orthodox Jews. And by living there, they have become, from being pragmatic about the territories, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to become actually part of the settled community. I think that has contributed to that process. And I don't see any possibility of shifting the ground very soon in Israel. I think it's likely to continue this trend unless, again, as I said, there is a shift in the dynamic between the Israelis and the Palestinians, at which point you could also see a shift in the political constellation in Israel.
Our other commenters, anything in terms of your thoughts about what may happen to the status of rights for various individuals in these new constellations that may support a Netanyahu government?
Well, I do believe that, again, as I said before, Israel is a genuine and vibrant democracy. It's a very vocal democracy. People make their voices heard. I don't see any possibility that Israel in the near future would become an authoritarian country. So it is very much against the nature of the Israelis. They wouldn't allow it. They are not friars, as they say themselves. But at the same time, the political constellation is likely to continue. And it is also a reflection of the situation vis-a-vis the Palestinians. I believe that the Palestinian issue is a defining issue for the Israeli society.
Very good. I would like to hear, let's give a chance. Carmiel, do you want to comment? And we're gonna, if people are able, I'd like to get a couple more answers, then open it up, and we'll probably go till about 8:30 if you guys have. I've already gone 15 minutes beyond what my free ticket from each of you. So I hope that'll work. Carmiel, go ahead.
I've got two screaming kids in the background, so I'm not sure I'm going to make it all the way to
Okay.
8:30. But
So
I think
we'll
we
get
might.
in the same boat.
Okay, so we'll get you real quick let's go around for closing thoughts then. What do you sort of predict might happen, and where do you see the role, and what's going to happen to, if you will, the liberal Jews? Are they going to, and in this polarization that's going on worldwide is certainly going to affect Israeli society with one more coalition?
We should be first.
Who do you want to go first?
You go
Natan,
first.
you want to go first?
Yeah.
Look, I think, as you touched on, this is a formidable issue for American Jewry, for world Jewry, for secular Jews. In a lot of ways, I think this election is, and many of these elections, it's not just, pro-Bibi or against Bibi, pro-peace or anti-peace. It's also secular Jews versus religious Jews. And we're seeing that play out in very real and meaningful ways. I wish I had a prediction. I want to wait to hear what Natan says so I know what to think. I feel really conflicted about the direction that this is going to go. I think, for every step forward, we have two steps back. But the future of Israel will require both an ability to grow as a country, but also the sustaining support of world Jewry. And so this will only grow increasingly prominent in election discourse among the Israeli public, because it really is the fight for the identity of the future of the country. So here's to being optimistic, if in a limited way, about how this will play out. I think I have this hunch, and I'm not a betting woman, I'm not that silly, that we will meet again for a similar conversation sometime in the near future.
Natan, your thoughts?
Yeah, again, the betting, I don't know which way it will flip, of course, but either way, I don't see a quick exit from this sort of general scenario. Even if Netanyahu loses somehow, I've learned my lesson. I don't think he's exiting, quietly and going away. He still has a very strong hold on his party. I may be wrong, and it may be that the spell breaks if a new coalition is formed, especially by someone from the right. But my guess is that we'll still see Israel muddling through this for a while. The ambassador said a very important point. Israel, despite all this craziness, and it includes, by the way, no state budget for now over a year. Israel is working on, it should have yoga mats. It doesn't, because it's operating on 1/12 of the budget, but that budget is the 2019 budget. Israel had no budget in 2020 and now no budget in 2021. We're already end of March. So there is some very fundamental problems of governance. You can't have major reforms of, say, the military, which the chief of staff wants, and many other things. So there are some very important issues of governance. But as the ambassador said, there is also a fundamental fortitude to the institutions of Israel and to the atmosphere. To have a genuinely authoritarian regime in Israel would be so contrary to Israeli nature, and that it is very hard to imagine. I hope I'm not wrong. We will see an emergence of this. The question of the liberal camp and why it diminished is a long and complicated one. A lot of it has to do with demographics and history, as the ambassador said very well. It also has to do with the failure of the Oslo process and the Second Intifada, which had a dramatic blow on the fortunes of the left. But never say never. Things can always emerge and change. We're in a very strange time at the moment. It's not impossible that we see an alternative coalition coming up. It's hard, very hard to chart it, but it's not impossible. There is some real drama around the election tomorrow. And I do think that the moment after Netanyahu, probably led by a right winger, we could see Israel coming back to a little bit more of normal discourse, disagreements and yelling and all the usual stuff, but slightly more of a normal course. It may not be now, maybe it's in the fall, but I think it is possible.
So we used to all dance to the Israeli song Machar, Machar, and as we took this, I want to thank each of you. What we are blessed here in Washington to have such, and through AJC and you and Mr. Ambassador in New York, and the two of you, to Natan and to you, Carmiel, that I want to thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. This was incredibly informative. And I want to thank you for giving us so much of your time and your inspiration. What we do know is that whatever happens, we will analyze, but this tension between both the domestic real issues that you've all brought up that are playing and the international issues are not only, for Israel itself, but are going to affect us globally in so many ways. So tomorrow we'll begin to see which way the pendulum swings. And we want to thank you all for participating. Everybody have a good night. And thank you again, Mr. Ambassador, Natan. Thank you so much.